Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 15 years, guiding thousands of families through moments of competition, celebration, and occasional unexpected revelations on his stage. Throughout his extensive career in television, he had witnessed the complete spectrum of human emotion and family dynamics, from heartwarming demonstrations of trust and transparency to uncomfortable moments when hidden secrets surfaced under the pressure of public performance. However, nothing in his considerable experience could have prepared him for what would unfold on that July afternoon in 2024, when a wife's public confession about secretly taking money from her husband would leave Steve Harvey genuinely speechless and ultimately deliver one of the most complex and nuanced conversations about financial autonomy, partnership, and the difference between theft and reclaiming what should have been shared resources in the first place. The Montgomery family from Memphis, Tennessee stood ready to compete against the Chen family from San Diego, California, both families having traveled to Los Angeles excited about their opportunity to participate in America's most beloved game show. Yet beneath the surface of rehearsed smiles and coordinated outfits, a financial arrangement and its violations were about to be exposed that would challenge common assumptions about marital finances, individual autonomy, and the complicated dynamics of economic power within intimate partnerships. If you value authentic stories about families navigating complex financial dynamics and the importance of equitable partnership in marriage, please take a moment to engage with this content by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more powerful narratives about real families, confronting difficult truths about power, control, and partnership in their most intimate relationships. Marcus and Diane Montgomery had been married for 19 years, though the financial dynamics of those years had been characterized by arrangements that Diane had increasingly come to view as fundamentally unfair and controlling despite Marcus's insistence that they represented reasonable household management and financial responsibility. Marcus was 47 years old, a successful insurance executive whose career had provided substantial income for his family throughout their marriage. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions and having those decisions respected and implemented without significant challenge or resistance. Diane, 44, had worked part-time as a dental hygienist for the first 8 years of their marriage before transitioning to full-time homemaker status when their second child was born, and Marcus's income had increased to levels that made her continued employment financially unnecessary from a purely economic perspective. Their children completed the family lineup on the Family Feud stage. 17-year-old Jessica stood near her parents with the awareness of a teenager who had observed her parents' financial dynamics and formed her own opinions about fairness and autonomy that she had thus far kept largely to herself. 14-year-old Tyler displayed enthusiasm about being on television that was genuine and uncomplicated by the financial tensions that had characterized his parents' relationship for most of his life. Marcus's sister Patricia, 42, rounded out the 5-person team, included in the Family Feud appearance at Diane's insistence as someone who might provide support and perhaps bear witness to dynamics that Diane was increasingly determined to address publicly after years of private frustration and failed attempts to negotiate more equitable financial arrangements with her husband. What made the Montgomery family situation particularly complex was the specific nature of their financial arrangement and the ways in which Marcus had structured household finances to maintain control over resources and decision-making authority despite Diane's contributions to the family through years of paid employment, followed by full-time household management and child rearing. When Diane had transitioned from part-time employment to full-time homemaker status 11 years earlier, Marcus had established a system whereby he controlled all family finances and provided Diane with a monthly household allowance that was intended to cover groceries, children's activities, household supplies, and her personal expenses. This allowance was fixed at a specific amount that Marcus had determined was reasonable and sufficient for necessary expenditures, though it had not been adjusted or increased in the 8 years since it was initially established despite rising costs of living and the growing expenses associated with raising 2 children through their teenage years. The household allowance system required Diane to account for her spending in detail, providing receipts and explanations for purchases that exceeded what Marcus considered routine or necessary household expenses. Marcus reviewed these expenditures regularly and would question or criticize spending that he deemed unnecessary or frivolous, even when such spending fell within categories that most people would consider normal personal expenses, such as clothing, haircuts, or occasional meals out with friends. Diane had no independent access to credit cards or bank accounts beyond the household checking account into which Marcus deposited her monthly allowance, creating a situation where she was financially dependent on Marcus's continued provision and approval, even for basic personal needs and modest discretionary spending. This financial arrangement had become increasingly intolerable for Diane, as she recognized through conversations with friends and through her own growing awareness of healthy relationship dynamics, that what Marcus characterized as responsible household financial management was actually a form of financial control that left her without autonomy, dignity, or the basic financial independence that adults typically enjoyed regardless of their employment status. She had attempted numerous times over the years to negotiate changes to their financial arrangement, suggesting that she should have independent access to family resources, or at minimum, that her household allowance should be increased to reflect actual costs of living and adjusted regularly to account for inflation and changing family needs. Marcus had refused these requests consistently, arguing that the current system worked well and that Diane's desire for independent financial access reflected poor judgment about household financial management or potentially concerning spending tendencies that justified maintaining the existing controls and oversight mechanisms. He would suggest that if Diane needed additional money beyond her monthly allowance, she should provide detailed justification for the need, and he would evaluate whether the expense was reasonable and whether family finances could accommodate it. This framing positioned Marcus as the sole authority on financial decision-making and positioned Diane as essentially a dependent who needed to justify and explain her needs rather than as an equal partner entitled to autonomous access to marital resources. The reality, which Diane had come to understand with painful clarity over the years, was that Marcus's financial control served multiple purposes beyond simple household budget management. It maintained his power and authority within the marriage by ensuring that Diane remained financially dependent on him and unable to make significant decisions or take independent action without his knowledge and approval. It allowed him to monitor and limit Diane's social interactions and personal activities by controlling her access to money that might enable her to spend time with friends, pursue hobbies, or maintain connections outside the home without accounting to him for every dollar spent. It reinforced a dynamic where Marcus's preferences and judgments took precedence over Diane's needs and desires, because he held ultimate authority over whether those needs and desires could be met through access to financial resources. Diane had reached a breaking point approximately 2 years before the Family Feud taping, when she recognized that she needed to establish some measure of financial autonomy and dignity, even if Marcus refused to modify the household financial arrangements voluntarily. She had begun systematically taking small amounts of cash from Marcus's wallet and from the household checking account in ways that would not be immediately obvious or easily traceable to specific transactions or expenditures. She would take $20 or $40 from his wallet when he left it unattended in their bedroom, amounts that were small enough that Marcus might attribute their disappearance to his own forgotten purchases or miscounting, rather than to deliberate taking by someone else. She would write household checks for amounts slightly higher than actual purchase prices and pocket the difference, or she would claim that certain purchases had cost more than they actually did and retain the surplus funds. Over the course of 2 years, Diane had accumulated several $1,000s through this systematic taking of small amounts that individually might go unnoticed, but that collectively represented a meaningful sum that she had hidden in a separate bank account that Marcus knew nothing about. She used this money to pay for personal expenses that she believed were reasonable and normal, but that Marcus would have questioned or denied if she had requested additional allowance to cover them. She used it to maintain friendships through occasional lunches or coffee meetings that Marcus would have considered unnecessary expenditures. She used it to purchase small items for herself or the children that brought pleasure or comfort, but that did not fall within Marcus's definition of necessary, spending worthy of approval and provision. Diane understood that what she was doing could be characterized as stealing from her husband, taking money without his knowledge or consent from his wallet and from household accounts. However, she had come to view her actions through a different framework that made them feel less like theft and more like reclaiming resources that should have been available to her as an equal partner in the marriage. But that had been withheld through Marcus's unilateral imposition of financial controls that denied her basic autonomy and dignity. She believed that the money she took was not actually Marcus's personal property, but rather marital resources to which she had legitimate claim, but was denied access through a system that Marcus had established without her genuine consent or agreement. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged through the insurance company where Marcus worked, part of an employee engagement initiative that the company had established in partnership with the show. Marcus had been excited about the opportunity to appear on national television and to demonstrate his family on a public platform. Diane had agreed to participate with profound ambivalence, recognizing that the public setting might provide an opportunity to address financial dynamics that she had been unable to change through private conversation and negotiation with Marcus over the course of their 19-year marriage. The game began with standard Family Feud energy and production quality, Steve Harvey engaging both families with his characteristic warmth and humor. The Chen family presented as genuinely collaborative and supportive, their interactions demonstrating comfortable equality and mutual respect among family members. The Montgomery family's dynamics were more controlled and hierarchical, with Marcus clearly positioning himself as the family leader and primary decision-maker, even in the context of a game show where such formal authority structures were unnecessary and potentially counterproductive to collaborative gameplay. It was during the second round that the moment occurred which would lead to the confession that left Steve Harvey genuinely speechless and triggered one of the most complex conversations about marital finances that had ever occurred on the Family Feud stage. The survey question addressed a common source of tension in marriages, asking contestants to identify things that spouses might hide from each other. Expected responses included purchases they had made, time spent with friends, mistakes or errors they had committed, or feelings and emotions they were experiencing, but had not shared with their partner. The question was designed to elicit relatively lighthearted responses that acknowledged normal human tendencies toward privacy or avoidance of conflict, even within intimate partnerships. However, what transpired went far beyond typical game show territory and into genuinely complex ethical and relational questions about financial autonomy, power dynamics, and the difference between hiding something out of healthy boundary maintenance versus hiding something because fundamental relationship dynamics made transparency unsafe or impossible. Marcus Montgomery provided an answer that inadvertently set the stage for what would follow. He suggested that spouses might hide spending or purchases from each other, an answer that was clearly drawn from his own experience managing and monitoring household finances, and that reflected his awareness that people often avoided full disclosure about expenditures to escape judgment or criticism. The answer appeared on the board as a top response, validating Marcus's suggestion and allowing the Montgomery family to continue playing the round. As play continued around the family, Diane found herself facing a choice about whether to maintain the silence and privacy she had maintained for 2 years about her systematic taking of money from Marcus, or whether to use this public platform to reveal what she had been doing, and why she had felt compelled to establish financial autonomy through means that she knew Marcus and many observers would characterize as theft or betrayal. In a moment of decision that she later described as both terrifying and liberating, Diane chose transparency and public revelation over continued secrecy. When Steve Harvey approached Diane for her answer to the question about what spouses might hide from each other, she took a deep breath and spoke with a clarity and directness that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the studio from lighthearted game show competition to something far more serious and emotionally charged. Diane stated that she needed to confess something publicly that she had been hiding from her husband for 2 years, something that related directly to the question, but that went beyond simple game show answers into genuine revelation about their marriage and their financial dynamics. Steve Harvey's expression immediately reflected concern and uncertainty about what was about to be revealed, his game show host persona giving way to genuine human reaction to a contestant who was clearly preparing to disclose something significant and potentially damaging. The studio audience fell silent with anticipation, sensing that whatever Diane was about to reveal would be far more substantive than typical Family Feud content or contestant personal stories. Diane explained to Steve Harvey and to the studio audience that for the past 2 years, she had been systematically taking money from her husband Marcus without his knowledge or consent. She described how she had taken cash from his wallet in small amounts that would not be immediately noticed, how she had padded household expenses and kept the difference, how she had accumulated several $1,000s through these systematic takings that she had hidden in a bank account that Marcus knew nothing about. She acknowledged that what she had done could be called stealing, and that she understood Marcus and others might view her actions as theft and betrayal of trust within their marriage. The revelation hung in the air as the studio audience processed what Diane had just confessed, their collective reaction reflecting shock and confusion about why someone would choose to reveal such information publicly, and what context might explain or justify behavior that appeared on its surface to constitute clear theft from a spouse. Marcus stood frozen beside Diane, his face reflecting a complex mixture of shock at learning this information for the first time, anger at the betrayal and deception it represented, and humiliation at having his marriage's private financial dynamics exposed on national television. Steve Harvey stood genuinely speechless for several long seconds, his jaw literally dropping in reaction to the unexpected confession he had just heard. When he finally found words, his voice reflected the complexity of trying to navigate a situation that was far more nuanced than simple theft or betrayal. But that also could not be dismissed as entirely innocent or justified, without understanding the broader context of the marriage and its financial arrangements. Steve asked Diane directly why she had chosen to reveal this information publicly rather than discussing it privately with Marcus, and more fundamentally, why she had felt compelled to take money from her husband in the first place, rather than simply asking for what she needed or negotiating changes to their financial arrangements through honest conversation and mutual agreement. The questions were fair and reflected the natural confusion that anyone would feel hearing about systematic taking of money by one spouse from another without any explanation of circumstances or motivations. Diane's response to Steve's questions transformed the narrative from simple confession of theft into a far more complex story about financial control, autonomy, and the ways in which apparently reasonable household management systems could actually constitute abuse when they denied one partner basic dignity and independence. Diane explained the household allowance system that Marcus had established 11 years earlier when she had stopped working outside the home, describing how the allowance had remained fixed despite rising costs and growing family needs, how she had to account for every expenditure and justify her spending to Marcus, how she had no independent access to credit or banking beyond the household checking account with its limited monthly deposit. Diane described her repeated attempts over the years to negotiate changes to this arrangement, her requests for independent financial access or increased allowance that more accurately reflected actual household needs, and that included appropriate provision for her personal needs as an adult deserving of basic autonomy and dignity. She explained Marcus's consistent refusal of these requests and his framing of her desires for financial independence as evidence of poor judgment or concerning spending tendencies that justified maintaining the existing controls. Diane then articulated why she had come to view her taking of money not as theft, but as reclaiming resources that should have been available to her as an equal partner in the marriage, but that had been withheld through a financial control system that denied her basic autonomy. She acknowledged that her method of establishing financial independence was problematic and deceptive, but she argued that it had felt like the only option available to her given Marcus's refusal to negotiate or modify arrangements that left her financially dependent, and without the dignity of autonomous decision-making about even modest personal expenses. Steve Harvey listened to Diane's explanation with an expression that reflected the genuine complexity of trying to evaluate behavior that appeared wrong on its surface, but that emerged from circumstances that themselves constituted a form of abuse or control. When Diane finished speaking, Steve turned his attention to Marcus with questions that made clear he was not simply accepting Diane's framing without challenge, but that he also was not dismissing her concerns about financial arrangements as irrelevant to evaluating the morality of her actions. Steve asked Marcus directly whether Diane's description of their financial arrangements was accurate, whether he had indeed established a system where Diane received a fixed monthly allowance that had not increased in 8 years, and where she had to account for and justify her spending to him. Marcus confirmed that this description was accurate, but attempted to frame the arrangement as reasonable household financial management rather than problematic control, arguing that someone needed to manage family finances responsibly and that the allowance system ensured accountability and prevented wasteful or unnecessary spending. Steve's response to Marcus's justification was direct and unambiguous in its assessment that the financial arrangement Diane had described was not reasonable household management, but rather a form of financial control that denied Diane basic autonomy and dignity regardless of whether Marcus's intentions were benign or controlling. Steve explained that in healthy marriages, partners had equal access to marital resources and equal authority over financial decisions regardless of which partner generated income through employment outside the home. He described how household management and child rearing were valuable contributions to family well-being that entitled the person providing those services to full partnership status, including autonomous access to resources, rather than dependent status requiring permission and justification for basic expenses. Steve made clear that while Diane's method of establishing financial autonomy through secret taking of money was problematic and represented a breach of trust, the underlying situation that had prompted her actions was itself deeply problematic and constituted a form of financial abuse that Marcus needed to recognize and address. Steve told Marcus that providing your spouse with an allowance that had not increased in 8 years, while you maintained sole control over all other family resources, was not partnership or reasonable management, but rather control that denied Diane basic dignity and independence. The confrontation continued with Steve facilitating a conversation between Marcus and Diane about financial arrangements and partnership that was uncomfortable but necessary given the revelations that had emerged during the taping. Marcus struggled to accept that his financial management system constituted abuse or control, arguing that his intentions had been to maintain household financial stability and prevent overspending rather than to deny Diane autonomy or dignity. Steve acknowledged that intentions mattered, but that impact mattered more, and that regardless of Marcus's intentions, the system he had established had left Diane without basic financial independence and had driven her to secret actions to establish autonomy that should have been available to her through transparent and equitable partnership. The game was suspended as Steve, the production team, and family relationship counselors who were brought in to assist determined how to handle a situation that had gone far beyond typical Family Feud territory into genuine marital crisis, requiring professional intervention. The episode never aired in its original form, with the decision made that broadcasting the confession and confrontation would serve no positive purpose and might actually harm the family's ability to work through the complex issues that had been exposed during the taping. However, Steve did address the incident in general terms during a later episode, discussing the importance of financial equity in marriage and the reality that controlling a partner's access to resources constituted abuse regardless of how such control was framed or justified. He spoke about the difference between collaborative household financial management, where both partners had equal access and authority, versus control systems, where one partner maintained power over the other through restrictions on financial autonomy. The immediate aftermath of the public confession was difficult and painful for the Montgomery family. Marcus was furious about Diane's revelation and her characterization of his financial management as abusive or controlling, arguing that she had betrayed his trust through systematic stealing, and then had compounded that betrayal by publicly humiliating him on national television. Diane maintained that while her methods had been wrong, the underlying need for financial autonomy was legitimate, and that Marcus's refusal to recognize the problematic nature of their financial arrangements demonstrated exactly why she had felt unable to address the situation through honest conversation and negotiation. The Montgomery family entered intensive marriage counseling in the weeks following the Family Feud taping, working with a therapist who specialized in financial dynamics and power imbalances within intimate partnerships. The therapeutic process revealed the depth of Marcus's need for control and his fundamental misunderstanding of what equitable partnership required in terms of shared access to resources and collaborative decision-making. It also addressed Diane's breach of trust through her systematic taking of money and helped her recognize that while her need for autonomy was legitimate, Her method of achieving it had created additional problems that now needed to be addressed alongside the original financial control issues. Progress in counseling was slow and marked by significant resistance from Marcus, who struggled to relinquish control and to accept that his financial management system had constituted a form of abuse regardless of his intentions. Diane had to work through her own feelings about the deception she had practiced and to develop healthier methods of asserting her needs and boundaries in the relationship. The counselor helped them establish new financial arrangements that provided Diane with independent access to resources and equal authority over financial decisions, while also addressing Marcus's legitimate concerns about household financial stability and responsible management. 1 year after the public confession on the Family Feud stage, the Montgomery marriage remained intact, but had been fundamentally restructured in terms of financial dynamics and decision-making authority. Diane had independent access to bank accounts and credit, and financial decisions were made collaboratively rather than unilaterally by Marcus. The money Diane had accumulated through her 2 years of systematic taking had been disclosed and discussed, with the couple deciding together how those funds would be used within their restructured financial partnership. Marcus had made genuine, though incomplete, progress in recognizing how his control had harmed Diane and their marriage, though he continued to struggle with fully relinquishing the authority and power he had exercised for 19 years. Steve Harvey maintained periodic contact with the Montgomery family through their counselor, checking on their progress and offering resources and support for their ongoing work to build a healthier and more equitable partnership. He spoke about the incident in later interviews as an example of the complexity of evaluating behavior that appeared wrong on its surface, but that emerged from circumstances that themselves constituted abuse or control, and of the importance of examining power dynamics and equity in intimate partnerships rather than simply focusing on individual actions divorced from their broader context. If this story has reinforced your understanding that financial equity is essential in healthy partnerships, that controlling a spouse's access to resources constitutes abuse regardless of intentions, and that evaluating behavior requires understanding the context and power dynamics from which it emerges, please take a moment to like this content and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about families navigating complex dynamics and working to build healthier and more equitable relationships.